I am Gina Sudam. I'm the president of the Wyoming County Chamber of Commerce, and I also have to thank all of my chamber partners who were instrumental in getting 97 people registered for this morning's webinar. So I'm very excited to have all of you with us this morning, and especially the Chamber of the Northern Poconos, who connected with Matthew Lyons first from Disaster Blaster and asked if we could get this presentation coordinated. Holly at the Northern Poconos Chamber knew that this would be a great success and asked if we would host on our platform, given that we have room for over 100 people, and we just about hit that this morning. So thank you, Matthew, for this great content. We're all very excited for this timely and critical information this morning. Thank you to all my fellow chambers for sharing this information out and getting it up on our site, and for all of you for taking the time to join us this morning. Again, welcome, Matthew, and thank you for the great presentation you have prepared for us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Disaster Blaster this morning?
Sure. Thanks for having us, and good morning, everybody. Disaster Blaster is a indoor environmental firm that specializes in a lot of things with regards to that. So infectious disease disinfection. I have a list of our various services here. So because of our focus and our specialty, we were approached to participate in this webinar and to provide some additional information. We've been providing a lot of information similar to this through our social media. So if anybody has an interest, they can feel free to also follow that. But I also recommend that you follow the chambers because they're providing a tremendous amount of information through this whole coronavirus shutdown and the upcoming reopen. So that'll help businesses a lot. Oh, Gina, you're...
And if I unmute myself, then you can hear me, right? So we all know that going back to work means wearing a mask. It's common practice right now, but it's also been common practice at Disaster Blaster. What would you share with us about wearing a mask properly?
One of the things, businesses are going to have to look at this from a training standpoint largely, because providing masks to your workers or wearing them yourselves requires training. So you're going to have to go over proper use. So first and foremost, you want to make sure that a mask has a tight seal on your face. Even the cloth masks, they're not really designed to have as tight a seal as something like an N95 or better, but they shouldn't be ill-fitting. They should still have a tight contact on the sides of your face and along the bridge of your nose, so that you have as much protection as possible, and you're providing that to others around you. Along those lines also, you want to make sure that it's properly covering your nose and your mouth, and it stays there through the duration of your work or whatever you're particularly doing. A lot of people tend to fidget with their masks because they're not really used to having something on their face. I completely understand that, but you're kind of defeating the purpose when you keep adjusting it and moving it around and putting your hands that close to your face and things as well. So we certainly want to try to avoid touching our mask as much as possible, and I would encourage businesses that see their employees doing that to take some sort of a corrective action and remind them that they really shouldn't be doing that. Along the lines of getting a good fit on your mask, you do have to keep in mind facial hair and anything of that nature can obstruct that fit. So people with beards and things may want to look at temporarily changing their look, just so they make sure that they have as good a fit as they possibly can with their masks.
Great.
Sorry, go ahead.
Nope, that's okay. If you have something about this, keep going.
Okay. Two last points. Fabric masks are not really intended to be worn more than once. So you want to make sure that you're washing that regularly after each use. And because of that, business owners are going to have to look at providing their staff with multiple cloth masks. So they have one that they can wear while the other one is being washed.
Right.
So that's one thing a lot of people haven't really thought through just yet, but that's going to be very, very important because they're going to have to be protected while they're cleaning and drying their mask.
Sure, because many of us are only leaving our homes, once a week or once every 2 weeks, so we have that one mask.
Yes.
But certainly when we go back to work, we'll need one for every day, right?
Yeah. So that depends on how you want to do it as a business, but you want to make sure that they have enough. And then along the lines of safety equipment in general, anytime you remove safety equipment, hand washing should be part of that process, because maybe you've touched the mask and it was dirty. I mean, once the mask goes on, you kind of have to assume that it is. So you're going to want to wash your hands to make sure that you've addressed any potential contamination.
Right. Very good. So for many of us, going back to work also means adding an extra layer of protection. But wearing gloves is tricky, I hear. Can you talk to us a little bit about wearing gloves and when it's proper to use them?
Sure, absolutely. Anytime you or your employees are coming in contact with anything that others are also coming in contact with, so if you're working a register and you're scanning items that customers are bringing up to you, or you're handling money or credit cards or anything of that nature, you really should be wearing gloves just as an added layer of protection. But along those lines, the employees and the business owner have to be well versed in the proper use of gloves. First and foremost, once your glove goes on, you have to assume that it's dirty. A lot of people have this thought that they're almost invincible when they have the gloves on and they're safe from anything. And the truth of the matter is those gloves could be picking up anything during the course of what you're doing. So you want to make sure that you're not touching your face with your gloves, that when you're removing your gloves, as an example, you're not touching the dirty part of the glove with your bare hand. You're washing your hands after you've taken the gloves off. And very importantly, and one thing that people really don't think about very often, is you're disinfecting anything that you've touched with your gloves. So that might be your cell phone, that might be your purse or wallet, that might be credit cards. Those things you should really assume are dirty until you've disinfected them. So yeah, it's very important. And then of course, gloves really aren't intended to be reused. So you should dispose of them after each use properly.
Great advice, Matthew. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There are many uncertainties, of course, about returning to work. What are some changes that we can expect in the workplace?
Well, first and foremost, I do want to mention that every business is different. So we'll be covering some standard things that businesses should be thinking about, but everything's going to have to be tailored to your particular needs. So some things that we can likely expect as we begin to reopen. Employees are likely going to need masks and gloves. Cloth masks should be adequate for most purposes, and they are available for business owners that are looking for them to purchase. And along those lines, we've been social distancing for quite a while. That's not something that's going to be changing right off the bat here. We're probably still going to have to continue to do that. You're likely going to have to enforce that with your employees and customers, and you may have to change your customer flow a little bit to make sure that happens. With anything, this is very, very new. It's not something that we've, at many businesses really have dealt with before. So there's likely going to be some additional training that's going to be necessary, whether that means going over proper use of gloves and masks, or how, what areas they should be disinfecting between customers. There's likely going to be some additional training that businesses are going to have to kind of focus on. And with that, disinfection is going to be some time involved in that. So you're going to have to, perhaps, if you want your counters and your credit card machines may be disinfected between customers, you're going to have to allow time between customers in that flow to allow that to happen. So you may not have as many customers that you can handle in a day. You have to kind of break that up a little bit. One of the recommendations that has been made as well is that employees that can work remotely should absolutely continue to do that. We're certainly doing that as well. And any business that has workers that are able to do that, whether that's telework members or clerical staff or management, they should continue to try to do that as much as possible, so you limit the number of people in your business and in your space. And along the lines of the flow in general is your customers themselves may prefer less face-to-face interactions going forward. I'm not sure how this is really going to play out, because it can go one of two ways. We can have customers that stick with this concern and this preference to curbside pickups and less face-to-face interactions. And we could also have customers that are finally allowed to get out of the house for the first time and are suddenly storming stores. So you could kind of be managing two different sort of issues. You may have to repeatedly remind them of the need to social distance and things, and you may have to kind of change the way your flow really works. So that's one thing with customers that people are going to really have to kind of take day by day and address it as it's needed. Customers should absolutely be wearing masks when they come to your business, and I would recommend very clear signage be posted just to remind customers and staff of various things. So whether that is signage reminding staff to wash their hands or the proper use of gloves and masks, or it's signage for customers such as, if you have clothing racks as an example, one customer per rack. Every business is going to have to kind of approach what works best for them and what needs their business is going to need to address. So I do think signage is going to be very important.
And even we talked yesterday, Matt, about posting a sign on your door to say all customers must be masked. That's a Pennsylvania rule right now. It is not something that you can make a choice to let them in your store without a mask on. You absolutely should be posting a sign and saying you need to wear a mask to enter our building.
Yeah, and at this point, given the requirement, and I mean, it's been in place for a couple of weeks here now, most customers should have access to a cloth mask at this point. So I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation for businesses to have. And your customers wearing those cloth masks is protecting your employees. So it's very, very important.
Right. So as an employer, we certainly
so I think signs like that, yeah. So I think signs like that's really worthwhile.
Definitely. So let's talk about the steps for disinfecting before we reopen, right? The real meat of this presentation today. So
Sure.
Can you walk us through that and what that looks like?
Sure, absolutely. A lot of businesses are kind of dealing with something like this for the first time. So most businesses and managers have not been in a situation where they really have to go through their business and catalog what items people come in contact with regularly. So I recommend starting the process by kind of making a list. And I would focus on two different lists essentially. One for what items are going to need to be or should be disinfected as part of the broader procedure to get everything reopened. And one list for items that customers and employees come in contact with regularly that you're going to want to disinfect regularly as part of a maintenance. Whether that's depending on the item, whether that's between every customer or once or twice a day, it's something that gives your employees a checklist that they can kind of go down and make sure that everything is being taken care of properly and timely.
Right.
So along those lines, you want to focus on heavily touched surfaces. This is one thing that a lot of people don't really think about, but there's a lot of surfaces that we touch all the time, and they are filthy, but we don't really think of them as that. So credit card terminals are a big one, keys, keyboards and mice, your cell phone is a big one. So you want to kind of go through and pay attention to the things that people are touching regularly and address those. That might be, if you're disinfecting shopping carts or, you have to kind of think through the whole process. One of the things that really, that a lot of people don't really think about are doorknobs and light switches. So, they're very dirty. They are easy to pick something up from because so many people handle them in the course of a day, but they're not often disinfected. So you may want to go through a couple times a day and disinfect, doorknobs and light switches and, those sorts of things. Credit card terminals is a big one as well for businesses.
I also thought in our office, we have a thermostat that we're constantly, turning up and down. And that might be something that people would often forget, is to wipe those thermostats off.
Absolutely. In an office setting, thermostats are a big one as well. Coffee pots, if you have a meeting area or, these are all things that you might not think about, but that you're going to have to kind of address regularly.
Sure.
As part of the disinfection, you want to make sure that you're using proper safety equipment, you're taking proper precautions. So if you're doing, first off, anytime you're doing disinfecting or cleaning generally, you really should be wearing gloves. So, that's just a necessity for that sort of a thing. As far as respiratory protection, as far as the masks are concerned, for maintenance type disinfection, if you're disinfecting the credit card terminal or the conveyor belt or something like that between customers, that can be addressed with a fabric mask, with a cloth mask. But if you are getting really, really involved and you're, disinfecting top to bottom and you're getting ready to reopen, for something like that, a cloth mask would be considered inadequate. So while we don't want to take any N95 masks from our medical personnel and first responders because they absolutely need that, if you have one, or if the supply chain opens up a bit between now and your business reopening, it wouldn't be a bad idea if you can have something like that for that work specifically. And then everything else you can focus on with the cloth mask.
Good tips, Matthew. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. You also want to make sure whenever you're doing something like this that you're using effective cleaners and that you've read all of the instructions on the bottle. I know most people don't read those sorts of things, but it's incredibly important. You want to look for a product that specifically lists that it's able to address coronavirus as an example. While COVID-19 is a new type of thing, coronavirus itself has been around for quite some time. So a lot of products will list that as something that it does in fact kill. If you're using a product that dilutes, you're going to want to make sure that you're mixing that properly because you want to make sure that it is going to be effective. And if you're coming back into your office and it's been closed up for a couple of months and you have a layer of dust, as an example, most disinfectants don't really work through layers. So you may have to clean it and disinfect it, maybe 2 passes to make sure that you get everything.
That's a really good tip because many of us have been closed for quite some time now. So our offices are kind of sitting vacant and might be kind of collecting that layer of dust.
Yes.
Certainly.
Yeah, so you just want to make sure that you're as thorough as possible through the process.
We have a quick question here, Matt, that I know we talked about yesterday. Is a solution of 1/3 cup of bleach to 1 gallon of water appropriate for killing the virus?
The CDC has confirmed that bleach will work for coronavirus. The one thing you want to keep in mind with bleach is that if it is out of date or expired, it does lose its effectiveness. So you want to make sure that you're using a product that is within its date.
And who would have thought that those products expire, right?
Matt,
yeah. You're right. Here's another great question is, do you assign someone to wipe these surfaces, or do you recommend it kind of being on the supervisor? Again, I know we're going to talk about liability down the road, but what do you recommend there as far as disinfecting in between?
Yeah, that depends very much on the flow of your business. I think ultimately it does fall on the manager to make sure that that's happening because it's incredibly important. And I would consider it a priority of their position to make sure that the staff that report to them are doing these things effectively and timely. But that entirely depends on your business. If you have multiple cashiers, as an example, you're probably better off having each of those cashiers disinfecting the belt or the counter and the credit card machine and things like that between each customer. Whereas if you have an office space, let's say that you have some customers coming into for whatever reason, you may have a dedicated staff that maybe goes through and disinfects the waiting area would be a big one. So you're disinfecting the chairs between appointments or something like that. So it depends on what works best for your business. And I would encourage everyone to kind of think through their flow to see how they can address that before multiple people are touching surfaces. So,
great tips. Thank you.
Sure. Along the lines of disinfecting and using disinfectants, you want to make sure that you're giving them adequate dwell time. So dwell time is essentially the time in which the surfaces remain wet with disinfectant. That's when disinfectant does the work, when it's killing viruses or bacteria or what have you. So if you're wiping down a surface with a disinfectant and you're immediately going over with a dry rag to dry it, it may not be as effective. So you want to make sure you're following the recommendations for the product and you're allowing adequate dwell time. Some products may require that you allow them to dry naturally. So it depends very much on the product. So you want to make sure that you're doing that as well. And then along the lines of disinfection, you want to make sure that you're working from top to bottom. As you can see in this picture here, we've got different shelves and different layers of counter and things like that. If you clean bottom to top, you're very likely to disturb something on a higher shelf that deposits on the shelf you just cleaned below. So you want to make sure you start from the top and you work your way down so that everything is in fact clean when you're done. you don't want to make your work any harder than it needs to be. So, so that's important.
Speaking of making your work harder, I'm looking at this countertop, and this looks like, many countertops in our local businesses. We all want our customers to make those impulse buys, right? Buy that candy bar when you buy your coffee and so on. But given the current status, would you recommend maybe eliminating some of these items that are sitting next to the cash register?
I would, yeah. I mean, I can certainly understand having that stuff out, but you're going to want to clean those surfaces and anything that your customers have been in contact with regularly. So having all of that out at this juncture kind of makes your job harder. So what I would do personally is I would try to have as little in my way as possible, and anything that your customers wanted, you could retrieve from behind the counter or something like that, just to minimize contact
Right.
with those things.
We even
Because,
talked, oh, go ahead.
sure. Oh, go ahead.
We even talked yesterday about, magazines and waiting rooms, right? Things that are picked up frequently. We want to kind of eliminate all that stuff out of our waiting rooms. They might be boring for a while, but
Yeah.
let's not have them in there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you have a waiting room with magazines or kids' toys or brochures or anything of that nature, you may want to pull that out of your waiting room for the time being. Brochures you could handle as something you provide to them as they ask for it, perhaps. Because how many people take a brochure and then put it back? You know, it and then someone else can take that later. So it's a good idea to try to think through the whole process and what occurs throughout the day, and try to minimize things that your customers have access, readily access, or ready access to. So that's a really, really good point.
Yes. And again, I think you're definitely hitting on some things that are close to home for many of us. We are getting a lot of questions, and I forgot to mention that Matt is going to be back with us on Friday for what we call our follow-up Friday. So Matt is here today as a part of our Restart, Rebound, Rebuild series. And every Friday we bring our two experts back. So this Friday we'll be bringing our tax and accounting expert, as well as Matt, back to answer some of the questions that we may not get to today, because again, this is a lot of information, and we know we're hitting you and with a lot of information, and we also know that you have a lot of questions, some of which pertain directly to your business. So when we post this, you will have Matt's information available, and I'm sure he'd be happy to answer any specific questions directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do that if anybody reaches out to me. And we certainly appreciate all of the questions, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can on Friday as well.
Great. Well, let's keep going with what we're cleaning up.
Okay. So, you clean your bathroom all the time in a business anyway, of course, but you're going to have to step that up a bit. Depending on how much activity your bathroom sees, you may have to clean it a couple of times a day. And the process may be a little bit more detailed than it normally would have been for something like that. Because as you go into the bathroom, it's going to look clean because maybe you cleaned it the day before or earlier in the day. But you're still going to have to make sure that you disinfect those surfaces and make sure that everything is, in fact, going to be clean and disinfected. So you're going to focus on especially the counter, the sink faucets, the sinks, the toilets, door handles, anything of that nature, just to make sure that you've addressed anything that people are in fact touching.
Very good.
And then along those lines as well, you're going to want to make sure that you focus on common areas, waiting rooms, and meeting spaces, essentially anywhere that people congregate and collect. You had mentioned before with waiting rooms and the magazines and things, all great things that you kind of have to think through. So maybe you're disinfecting the chairs in your waiting area, or your your tabletop in the meeting space. You just have to kind of think through what people are touching.
Right. What are some of the common places that are overlooked? I'm looking at this table and it looks like many of our, conference room tables. I look at that little speaker sitting there, which I'm sure gets moved up and down the table, right? But what else? You mentioned the top of the table.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. You had mentioned yesterday when we were talking that about how people grab tables when they pull their chair in. So the underneath of the table can be dirty. So, everybody cleans maybe the top of the table, but they don't really clean the bottom of the table so much. So you may want to disinfect the areas where people are going to be potentially touching there. The speaker, absolutely. One of the things, to be quite honest with you, in meeting rooms that I don't think ever gets cleaned is the remote for the projector.
Right.
Nobody cleans that, and it can be held by 3 or 4 people maybe in the course of a meeting. So you want to make sure that you're disinfecting those sorts of things, and you kind of think through, like I had said before, anything that people are kind of coming in contact with and touching.
Right. We have a great tip from Esther, who is in charge of our electronic equipment at our local theater. And Esther says, don't spray your electronics, right? So don't spray that speaker. Make
Yes.
sure you wipe it with a saturated cloth. And I think that's a great tip to remember. There are a lot of things that we shouldn't be spraying, but rather wiping them with a disinfectant cloth.
Absolutely, and that's essentially, there's 2 different ways that you can disinfect. Essentially, there's spraying a disinfectant on a surface and wiping it, which can work for maybe the counters and the conveyor belts and things like that. But there's also a method called the bucket method, which essentially you mix a bucket of disinfectant and you put your clean rags in that, and then you take those out and you use them to wipe down surfaces after you wring them out. The importance of that method is that you do not put your dirty rags back in the bucket. So the bucket should only hold your clean rags. So.
Good point. Very good point. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we've been talking about all of this disinfecting, but without proper disinfecting, let's talk about some of the risks that are going to be there.
Sure, there's some liability that businesses are going to have to consider as part of the reopening and preparing for that. First and foremost is the liability they may open themselves up to if they're doing the large disinfection in preparation themselves. The maintenance disinfection is something that every business is going to have to do in order to ensure that their work environment remains safe through the course of the day and the week. But the main disinfection, if, as an example, you were to have a customer or an employee fall ill, and the question is asked who did the disinfection, and it's you, that liability could very much fall on your business. Whereas if you can say, okay, a professional did the initial disinfection, that would help a lot with regards to the potential liability that you might see. Additional to that would be the training. We had mentioned before with the gloves and the masks the importance of training to prepare and make sure that your employees are using this safety equipment properly. Training is going to, I feel, be a big one for businesses, particularly small businesses. If you're providing your employees with masks and gloves and other safety equipment, but you're not telling them how to properly use them, it opens you up to some liability concerns. So you want to make sure that you're going over that with your employees, and that you've posted in your office, reminders about those sorts of things. And then the last three, the workers' compensation claims, which as business owners, we all know work comp, and the Family First Coronavirus Response Act and how that applies to our businesses, as well as, while hopefully this never happens, the potential serious injury and death concerns that coronavirus does present, are all things that businesses really need to keep in mind and keep in the forefront as they're planning to reopen. I know you had held two other webinars that specifically talked about the liability things, the human resources webinar and the employment law webinar. So I encourage everybody to check those two out to get a little more informed about those sorts of things.
Great.
And those are both on your website, correct?
Yes, and I will post that link as well in our chat, so we have that link available.
Perfect.
For people to go check those out. They're pre-recorded, as well as this will be recorded and posted later today.
Okay.
Now, what are some of the new policies that you recommend businesses put in place to keep their workspace safe, their employees safe, and of course their customers safe?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, they really need a documented policy with regards to the use and the training of safety equipment. So if they're providing safety equipment to their employees, which they all should be, they should be showing them how that's used properly, and they should be documenting both the training and the provisioning of this equipment. So I think right off the bat, that's incredibly important because they're going to need to know how to properly use this. The average person isn't used to wearing a mask all day and the proper care and maintenance of that. So I think that a lot of businesses really need to kind of think that through and make that an ongoing training opportunity. And as you see employees doing things that are not recommended, you know, removing the mask during the day or touching the mask or wearing the mask below their nose, these are all opportunities to not just take a corrective action, but also to train everybody else to make sure that that's not something that anybody else is doing.
Right. I'm thinking about, you know, those of us who might work in our own office space. And so we put our mask on while we're out in the common areas and then take our mask off and lay it on our desk. Right. So I'm kind of thinking through some of these things that are already potential risk for us. So
yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I fully expect people to do, and it's a really bad idea, is to take off your mask in the course of the day, throw it in like a Ziploc or something, and then take it out later to put it back on. Well, the inside of that Ziploc is now filthy.
Right.
And it's not protecting anything. You know, you're really not protecting the mask from the outside air at that point. You're protecting it from itself because the outside of the mask is going to be dirty. So you're really, once the mask is on, you have to assume it's dirty. Same with gloves, and you can't reuse them until they're re-cleaned. So if you're in the process of needing to take your mask off for whatever reason, maybe you have a lunch break midway through your day, you should have 2 masks so that you can put a new one on after your lunch.
Very good point. And Matt, it was also brought up on here about people who may not be, for medical reasons, able to wear a mask all day. And I think that the recommendation there might be to try to get them as removed from your other employees and other customers or customers at all as possible, right? So if they can work in a more private space by themselves, that, you know, that way they don't have to wear a mask. But again, you have to protect them, especially if they have asthma or some condition that would prevent them from wearing a mask.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to try to protect them as best you can then at that point. One other thing that is recommended as part of the guidance for people that can't wear a mask, perhaps, is wearing a face shield or something. So you could always go that route as well. But over the general course of your day, you should be looking at every job and every position from the idea of how can you reduce as much as possible the face-to-face interactions that they may have. So some jobs that may be harder than others, but it should be something that everybody should kind of look at.
Very good. Very good. I think that was all my questions on that one, right? Okay. There we go.
And then you want to make sure that you post reminders for your staff. Here are a couple of great examples that we have put together. They are available on our website to download and print, and I know that you had said you would be posting links to them as well. They're simple reminders of some things that employees shouldn't be doing with their masks on. They're also great aids when you're kind of going over proper use. So you can use it as kind of like a training aid as well. Of course, regular hand washing is very extremely important. So you want to make sure that you're providing your employees with an opportunity throughout the day to do that. And of course, anytime they've taken off their safety equipment, they should be washing their hands. The social distancing, of course, we're going to have to not only maintain and continue, but businesses are going to have to enforce. So if you see customers that perhaps aren't abiding by that, or employees that aren't abiding by that, you're going to have to speak up and address it. You may have to restrict how many customers are coming into your business at a particular time to allow them to have space. One of the questions I keep getting is about businesses that their shop, let's say, is broken up into a bunch of smaller rooms. If you have a situation like that, you may have to put a sign up and say one person per room, just so that you can kind of control and encourage the social distancing. And then, of course, you're going to have to regiment these disinfection procedures. It's not necessarily good enough to say, okay, this is what we're going to do. You're going to have to post checklists and enforce this disinfection work. So your employees should have a very clear understanding of what they need to do and when. So if you want counters and credit card machines and things disinfected between each customer, I would post that at each register, so that they have that checklist to just kind of go down and make sure that that's done. And I would do that job specific. So if you have janitorial staff that are focusing on the disinfection of bathrooms and things, I would post that checklist for them and how frequently they should be doing that. And you're going to have to likely revise your customer flow. Every business is different, so we're going to have to look at how your business would best benefit in the reopening. A couple of ideas that I've had over time here is, first and foremost, if you have aisles, as an example, aisles really should be one way. So if you put signs up and you dedicate an aisle to be one way, that's a great idea, because even if you are trying to enforce social distancing requirements and somebody comes down the aisle the other way, you're now well within your 6 feet. So that's one that's incredibly important. Businesses may want to address customers that are touching product that they're not going to buy. You don't want that put back up on the shelf if at all possible. So I've been recommending to a lot of businesses to stage carts or baskets around their store for employee or for customers to put anything that they've touched in them, so that you can disinfect them before you put them back out on the shelf. So it all depends on your flow, but I think everybody needs to really think through what makes sense for them.
Very good. Monitoring employees' health. This is going to be a big one. What things should we be doing as employers to create that safe workspace?
First and foremost, I think every employer needs to ask each employee every morning if they've been out of the area and if they are exhibiting any symptoms that may be of concern. Employees may not necessarily offer that information if you're not asking them for it. So I do recommend having that conversation. And many businesses will likely also need to monitor employee temperatures. So you can get infrared thermometers and do that each day to kind of gauge if there may be a potential problem.
Very good. And you recommended again yesterday, kind of documenting that right in your employee folder, right, or
yeah,
employee file.
Yeah, it's certainly a good idea to keep a record of that, just in case you have a potential issue in the future or something.
Right, and we touched on that too as we talked about employment law, and it's your right as an employer to make sure that your employees are feeling well, and if they're not, or if you suspect that they're not, it is within your right as the employer to send them home.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be considering all of those things, again, to keep everyone else safe.
Yeah, we may have situations where we have employees that maybe aren't feeling quite right, but they don't want to not come to work. You know, whether that's, you know, dedication of some sort, or it's, you know, a need to get out of the house at this point. You know, whatever that reason is, they're much better off staying home. So businesses should be encouraging that. And I would make that policy incredibly clear to employees, because at the end of the day, you don't want an employee potentially bringing something into your office that could affect other employees.
Definitely.
So you want to make sure that that they're staying home if they don't feel well.
Good. Now, what should we look for in choosing a firm to disinfect our business before we get started?
Okay. Yeah, there's a couple of things you want to look for. First and foremost, you want to make sure that the company does this work regularly, and particularly that they were providing infectious disease disinfection well before it was a fad. Right now, we unfortunately have a lot of businesses that are suddenly providing coronavirus disinfection services, but they lack the training, the experience, and the equipment to do that properly. So you want to make sure that you're hiring somebody that is qualified to do that work, particularly somebody that specializes in indoor environmental issues. So, you know, that's not your contractor, it's not your janitorial type thing. It's a very specialized service.
Okay.
So like I had mentioned, you want to make sure that they specialize in indoor environmental issues. They should list infectious disease disinfection as a standard service. So that should actually be on their website, on their marketing materials. You shouldn't be in a situation where a company or an individual is saying, you know, well, I can do that for you, because what that really means is I can learn how to do it at your property. You want somebody that knows what they're doing and is qualified to do that work. One of the big red flags when you're hiring a company to really do anything, as far as I'm concerned, is the unrealistic guarantee. So that's one thing I always mention for people to keep an eye out for. Some examples of unrealistic guarantees in this particular situation would be a company or an individual that guarantees they can disinfect your space and that coronavirus can't come back, or it can't get in, or what have you. As businesses, we have employees and we have customers coming in all the time, and any one of those could bring coronavirus into the building. That's why maintenance disinfection is going to be so important beyond disinfection to get ready to reopen. Another example of an unrealistic guarantee that's incredibly common is a company guaranteeing they can have the work completed in a set period of time. So a company that says, oh yeah, I can have that done in half an hour, or I can have that done in an hour, they may be able to give you estimates, but if they are making a guarantee that it'll be done in a particular period of time, it's an unrealistic thing to say. So anytime you see something that just doesn't sound quite right, it usually isn't. They will be using proper safety equipment. This is incredibly important. These companies need to be protecting their staff. So here's an example of our crews, actually. So they're wearing protective clothing. They're wearing Tyvek suits. They have gloves on. They're wearing full face respirators. They're prepared for the work that they're doing. So, it's not, somebody with a mop bucket showing up, maybe with an N95 or a cloth mask, if they have that. You want to make sure that you have people that are taking this work seriously. Any company that's doing this work also should be using effective products. So they'll have products that not only have been proven effective against coronavirus, but they'll have products that are approved for various uses. So as an example here, they're spraying a product with a fogger, which aerosolizes the disinfectant. That can only be done with products that are approved for that use. So these companies are aware of what they can and they can't do, and they have the proper equipment and products to do the work properly. And we're at the end here. One thing that we did want to offer to everybody that may need disinfection of your business in preparation of reopening, we are offering a 10% discount on all coronavirus disinfection services for chamber members. So if you contact our offices, mention the chamber that you're in, and we would be happy to extend that to you.
And, unfortunately, I don't think you'll travel down to some of our Texas folks who have made it onto our call this morning, but well, I'm sure you could recommend to them what to look for, right?
Yeah, well, if I mean, I'm happy to help anybody. I've helped businesses over the last week start to prepare down in Virginia and things as well.
Oh, great.
I'm happy to do that. Obviously, if you need disinfection services, you'll have to find someone a little closer to you.
Right, but you could recommend what to look for, of course.
Absolutely, absolutely. But if we service your area, we're happy to extend the discount to you through the chambers here.
And Matt, do you do estimates? So we're getting a question about average cost, which is a tough, a tough question. If I have 17,000 square feet and another guy has 2,000 square feet, there's a big difference, I assume, in cost, right?
Yeah, it depends very much on what ultimately would be necessary and how much time would be involved in the disinfection process. If anybody wants an estimate, we certainly provide them. They're no obligation, of course. So if anybody contacts our office, we're happy to discuss their needs and tailor an estimate to that.
Terrific. Thank you.
Mhm.
And thank you very much for all of the information and for walking us through this very crucial process this morning. We appreciate your time and your expertise. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. As you can see, we have started this series and are going to be continuing it into next week. We're in our restart phase of our restart, rebound, rebuild process. On Friday, this Friday, we'll have tax and disinfecting back for follow-up Q&A. I know there were a lot of questions. I'm going to get your questions over to Matt so he will have answers for you on that Friday call. So please join us for that call. I know it says member exclusive. If you're not a member, don't worry. We are opening that up to everyone on Friday. Again, thank you for joining us. If you want to find this video later, you can use that link I have posted in the chat, or just go to wyccc.com. A big box will pop up that says COVID-19 resources. You can click there, and then you'll see our Restart, Rebound, Rebuild series logo. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. Thank you to everyone on the call. We appreciate your time and spending your morning with us. Thank you again for the informative information. Have a great day, everyone.